as another um, Pride Month winds down and we all collectively move on with our lives the way that we always do with these minority recognition focus months that literally are pretty much nothing but a concentrated retail campaign for selling specialized merchandise. Something that might be worthwhile to discuss is the rhetoric of born this way. It's considered a pretty effective emotional argument, and it has a decent amount of rhetorical weight to it. And it's usually worded in this fashion: that why would God forbid something if I don't have a choice in it? Why would God say that he disapproves of homosexuality, bisexuality, any other of these various non-heteronormative sexual preferences if he was going to make me this way? Or inverted, why did God make me this way if he disapproves of it? And of course, this is then extended, stretched to encompass not just orientation, but also the matters of transgenderism, transsexuality, which, if time permits, I'll get to. But let's, and we find it everywhere. It is in basically, it's almost ubiquitous in pop culture at this point. There's songs dedicated to it. It comes up in primetime television shows and dramas, films, just it's all over the place. And so, how should we approach it? As a Christian, how should I approach this conversation? The first thing worth noting is that there's been something of a pretty dedicated search biologically to find a biological anchor point for the claim that a person is born gay. They've tried to with the Human Genome Project, held out hope for a considerable amount of time that they were going to find something of a gay gene, a genetic chromosomal component that led to the manifestation of same-sex characteristics or orientations. And the reality is they didn't find it. We've completed the Human Genome Project underneath the leadership of Dr. Francis Collins, and simply it's not there. Now, to be totally fair and balanced as much as we can here, they also did not find a heterosexual gene either. That doesn't exist just the same as that there is no homosexual gene. So it's not as if we are going to find one or the other, that there's no genetic component here. It's something else. Additionally, a pretty comprehensive study was done regarding identical twins, fraternal sets, that in which one of the paired couples ended up choosing a sexual orientation of homosexuality, or you might say just manifesting it. And the test was to see whether or not the second member of the twin pair, or even beyond that, triplets and quadruplets and such, to see if any of these multiply would end up doing the same thing. And the matter is that they found that not only did the alternate in the twin pair not choose homosexuality as well. In fact, that it seems like they more so doubled down on their heterosexuality almost as a means of compensation towards the homosexuality of their alternate, or the second twin. And so this rules out a lot of other things like environmental factors, due to the fact that they're twins. They would have been raised by the same parents in the same parenting circumstances, socioeconomic status. They would have attended the same schools, had the same teachers in many instances, and so forth. And yet You have one that chooses heterosexuality and the other that chooses homosexuality. Why? The question still lingers in the air as to why this happened. We simply don't have a comprehensive answer to that question. What we do know is that it wasn't caused by any unique stimuli per se. We can point in pretty strong directions towards family relationships, especially relationship to a strong paternal parent and things of this nature, but simply we don't know for sure how this occurs. What we do know is that it's not inherently biological and it's not inherently environmental. It's most likely, if we were to just use our common sense machines here, that it's most likely a network of intervening factors that all work together. And we do know as well that it is likely a product of conditioning that individuals over time, due to exposures to different stimuli, they choose yes and no's to affirming them, to liking those things. And so there's a whole mess, a web of various features that need to be assessed here. What we do know for sure, like I've said multiple times now, is that it's not biological. And so what this tells us is that when a person says born this way, they're basically pulling a claim out of thin air that has no evidence, and that it has a lot of emotional persuasiveness to it. But as we all know, that anyone that has been in contact with the internet for 5 or less seconds knows that persuasiveness is not equal to factuality, is not equal to any sort of accuracy of a claim, just its persuasiveness. And there's many things that in fact are the opposite, that it's actual lies or simply just not true, yet is incredibly persuasive. And it'll draw in the interests of various people because it's more than just the claim itself. People have their own inherent biases as to why they are convinced of different things, why they assent to them. And so it's not simply the claim itself, but it also tells a lot about the people involved, that this has so much persuasiveness to it. Now, so it's not biological. And what it really amounts to is what people want to say is that it's not a choice I'm making. It's something that you might want to say that it chose me in some ways. And that makes them something of a product, makes them maybe even, you want to go so far as to say, a victim of circumstance, that they're incapable of acting outside of this directive. And this is problematic for multiple ways due to the fact that if we just simply grant somebody's inability to resist or a person's lack of personal choice in a desire, and then as a license for them to perform that, then where does that stop? Because it has to stop somewhere, and the only thing that you can point to as a reason to stop is legal precedent, it's illegal, or subjective opinion, it's taboo. And neither one of those has any kind of reliable staying pattern, because we're talking about homosexuality right now. That at one point was both considered a mental illness and illegal in many jurisdictions. Yet, here we are. And so anything that we would point to now as being unacceptable on the grounds of it being illegal or that it being a social taboo in the future, neither one of those statements might be true any longer. And in fact, we're seeing erosions of legal precedent against things like incest and against things like bestiality and against things like even pedophilia. Over time, give it 100 years, give it 50 years, are we going to be having the same conversation about those things that we are having about homosexuality now? And you can call that a slippery slope fallacy if you want, but again, it seems to be more of a accurate reading of history projected into the future. Though I'll grant that, of course, no one knows what the future is, but I think we can have some pretty strong predictions as to where this all is going. So, beyond that, even if I grant that it is biological, that it is some sort of unavoidable environmental factor that causes a person to be homosexual, even if I grant those things, still, that's not a license. It's basically irrelevant altogether, because if we're talking about being forbidden by God, there's a lot of things that are natural inclinations that are expressly forbidden by God because they are not good things. In fact, often they're the corruptions of a good thing, or that they are actually the weaponization of a otherwise good thing towards the destruction of man. And so, for example, theft, for example, coveting, for example, adultery, for example, like there's plenty of them that the Bible expressly forbids due to the fact that they cause irreparable harm to society, to individuals, and that often that damage cannot be, at the very least, easily undone, if at all. And so, just because you say that you were born this way, which again we have not any sort of justifiable evidence towards, still, that's not a license for you to do literally anything. And that it becomes something of a test of loyalty at that point, of that, are you going to trust God with your proclivities, or are you going to trust only yourself with them? Because if one of the things about humanity is that they are, if anything, fickle and unstable. They change over time. And so if you are going to use your inclinations, your orientation as a license to do things, what happens if that orientation changes? Are you going to then consider what you were doing wrong? What's the difference between calling it wrong now versus then? Additionally, what would you have to say to the other people that are looking at this same rationale, yet you consider their behaviors taboo? Additionally, what would you consider as an appropriate recourse? So it is a dangerous road to go down, to even consider this line of reasoning, especially due to its lack of evidentiary reasonability, but also due to the fact that its logical extremes are dangerous, destructive, and in even not their extremes, their general, like, moderate logical expressions are pretty destructive. So, and last but not least, that it's not exactly a special condition for you to be withheld things. I mean, there's a lot of things that we're withheld from that we think maybe that we deserve, but Christians have always recognized the importance of moderation as a pathway towards freedom. And that, in fact, Christians don't exactly have a monopoly on that reasoning, but it's pretty ubiquitous that moderation is a better path to freedom from bodily slavery. that in fact the indulgence of bodily inclinations results in a deeper form of slavery that's more dangerous to humanity than even the most restrictive of moderations or restraints. In fact, restraint is better for you because you end up learning more about yourself through the exploration of restraint than the expression of indulgence. So that, in fact, that and in here is a little bit of a rhetorical slant that the secularist or the homosexual might use, is the idea that why should a homosexual person be alone or be doomed to being alone or being deprived of sex or marriage simply because God doesn't approve? And the answer to that question is, why do you think you deserve those things? In fact, Scripture does say that it's better for a man to never have sexual relations. It's better for a man to never get married, because in his singleness, he'll have more freedom to be able to serve God wholeheartedly rather than having the division of his persuasions that comes from being married and having children. That he'll no longer be able to devote himself 100% to God, because he'll also have to look after his wife and the material needs of that she presents, as well as the children that eventually will likely be produced by their unity. So that it's not exclusively restrictive of the homosexual, but in fact it's actually promotive, more so, of a general restrictive that primarily puts glorifying God and submission to God's will as the highest of all available goods. And that also there's this thing called the church. It's something that's understated and often overlooked in this debate, but the idea that you have to live alone in a tower somewhere because you're a homosexual and feel attracted to someone of the same sex is absurd. That you can live in community with other Christian believers, and that through that community you can actually receive an as deep, if not more deeply fulfilling relational community than might even be available through the avenue of marriage. That the purpose of marriage is not simply so that two people can produce children, but in fact marriage actually exists as a means of the individual imitating the relationship of Christ and the church. And so if you have a devoted relationship with God in community in the church, and yet still maintain a celibacy, you actually might be able to cut out the middleman of marriage and have a more deeply intimate relationship with God as a result. Maybe. It's possible. So no, you don't have to live alone. You don't have to be isolated. You don't have to be emotionally cut off from the world around you. And that in a lot of ways, you're not even robbed of a significant intercommunity with others by not being able to marry. And something else that does need to be addressed here is the idea that attractions are solid. Mentioned a little bit earlier. You don't know that. You don't know that with any sort of certainty. That in fact, our attractions tend to be very fluid in that they tend to float back and forth based on conditional affection. That as you are affected by certain stimuli, you have the ability to generate new attractions, that they can shift from one thing to another, or you could lose them altogether. This is also heavily dependent on things like hormonal situation. That, for instance, many men, when they reach their 40s or 50s, as testosterone production begins to decrease, their sexual appetite tends to decline with it. as well as obviously we all know that the hormonal increase of adolescence causes a person often to generate new attractions that they had not experienced previously. So no, these things are not static. They are not some sort of solid boulders to build your life on, that in fact they are very structurally unsound and that they can assemble and deassemble based on personal choice and routine conditioning and regular pursuit and all sorts of other different interlacing stimuli. And so it is likely possible for a person to be able to decondition various kinds of attraction in one way or another. And that it is likely possible for a person through, let's say, submission to God and entrusting with God their desires and their attractions, that God can reshape that person's life and heart in a direction they have not experienced. And that even through general therapy, maybe, who knows? The thing that we don't know, or the thing that we do know for sure, is that you probably were not actually born this way. And that the people who have told you that you were born this way were telling you that for a specific reason, to manipulate you into thinking that you're powerless and to use you as a rhetorical pawn in their social chess game against traditional values. That's what we know for sure.